And we are live. Hello everyone, this is My Two Cents, and welcome back to my channel for what is sure to be a very complex and hopefully interesting stream. If you haven't, and looks like we have one other person joining here.
There we go.
Alright, Mikhail, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Awesome. Alright, so if you haven't been living under a rock, you'll know that this week we got the announcement of the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial. That was, we did talk about that a while back on my channel when the incident first happened involving George Floyd. The verdict was finally announced. Chauvin was found guilty on all counts, second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and manslaughter. Which, interestingly enough, it seems to me if you committed murder, then you didn't commit manslaughter. If you committed manslaughter, you didn't commit murder. But we'll get to that in just a second. But, of course, that didn't stay the story very long, because within minutes of that happening, there was another police shooting in Ohio, in which a teenager by the name of Ma'Khia Bryant was killed by a police officer after what appears, I'm going to say appears because that case has not been adjudicated and fully investigated, but the footage released shows that she seems to have been trying to stab another black teenager before she was shot. But of course, all of this is wrapped up in the huge national narrative right now that there is an epidemic of police racism against black individuals, and that therefore we need to tear down all the institutions and institute a new regime of social justice. It's really just cultural Marxism. The bourgeoisie and the proletariat have been changed to white and black and everything in between, and is the means by which they seek to institute an even more tyrannical government. But I want to talk about all these issues from the libertarian perspective, because I'm sure most of you out there have heard a lot of different commentary from a lot of different sources. I certainly have, and I've been frustrated that not a lot of people are talking about what I think are the most prevalent issues. So first, I just want to talk about, from a libertarian standpoint, let's go over again what actually happened involving George Floyd and Derek Chauvin. George Floyd was allegedly purchased cigarettes from a convenience store using a counterfeit bill, which prompted the clerk to call the police. The police arrived. George Floyd was using drugs at the time, at least methamphetamines and fentanyl. In an effort to, hoping to not get arrested, he swallowed the rest of the drugs that he had on him at the time, which of course, from a health standpoint, is not a good idea. But as it turns out, he had a number of other health issues going on, very severely clogged artery, and a past history of very serious drug use. He was arrested, resisted arrest, and of course the famous video clip was that went around at the time was the clip that was recorded of Derek Chauvin with his knee on Derek Chauvin's neck. Although the prosecution, the defense attorneys, I believe, tried to prove that it was actually on his back, not his neck. I don't know if that was, I did not see the footage that was shown, so at least other than the widely circulated video, so I'm not sure exactly what the verdict was on whether it was the neck or the back. But in any case, it looked like initially from the video, Derek Chauvin put his knee on his back, on his neck, and that resulted in George Floyd suffocating. And of course, if true, that would definitely be a case of police brutality. But as it turns out, Floyd had all these other complicating health issues, was already on drugs, and had swallowed another series of drugs he had on his possession, which made the situation that much more complicated. Which, to point out, I think it's important to note that even if it was the case that Chauvin engaged in brutal, unnecessary behavior, it could be possible that Chauvin engaged in brutal behavior that was not warranted, but it was nonetheless the case that his actions were not what caused George Floyd to die. Now, but I think perhaps what is going to turn out to be the most important factor in this case, and the one I want to talk about the most, is the fact that Chauvin, even if guilty, is supposed to be entitled to a free and impartial trial in front of a jury of his peers, in which the jury decides the case based solely on the facts of the case. But I don't think anyone can say that's really what happened, considering there was a mob outside the courthouse literally waiting to burn down the city if he wasn't found guilty. Sitting Congresswoman Maxine Waters, before the trial, traveled to Minnesota and encouraged the people held a rally in which she encouraged people, if he's not found guilty, you better be confrontational, you better be violent, we better show them that we mean business. And the local newspaper, the Star Tribune, more or less doxed all the jurors. They didn't actually release their names, but they released physical descriptions and details about each of them. And of course, living in that community, when that many details are released, it's not going to be that difficult to figure out who they were. So you had a jury who basically knew that if they did not find him guilty, their lives would be in danger and their city could be burned to the ground. So I hardly could say that was a impartial trial in front of an impartial jury in which only the facts of the case were considered. Mm-hmm. But anyways, that's the background. We'll start talking more in depth about some of those specific issues. But quickly, Night Shift, Mikhail, you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, go ahead, Night Shift.
Well, and here's the thing. I am actually kind of glad that Chauvin is going away because whether he was responsible for George Floyd's death or not, Derek Chauvin, as a police officer, had a prior history of violence as a police officer. And really, he has a file like a mile long, apparently. And he apparently engaged in violent acts as a police officer before this happened. And this was the only time that it ever got recorded, that it ever got documented, really. And that there was a clear-cut case of police brutality, because I've seen the video. But Derek Chauvin's knee was on the man's neck. It was not on his back. It was on his neck. And he stayed there for more than 5 minutes. He stayed there for long enough to where it could be to where it actually could be manslaughter, to where it could have been, what finally sealed the deal for George Floyd. I mean, and here's the thing. George Floyd, he had all of those things wrong with him, but that sure as hell didn't help him in this case. And so, honestly, I would say that what Derek Chauvin did was he just kind of sealed the deal. He kind of ended it. And he was the one, he was kind of the reason that all of those things kind of culminated. But even whatever it was, Derek Chauvin did actually have a prior history of violence as a police officer, and he is far better off the streets. He's far better off the streets as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. Mikhail?
I was just going to say, yeah, I absolutely agree with Night Shift. Now, given what I have seen, what I have observed, what I've read, the forensic reports and so on and so forth regarding George Floyd's death. Okay, it's not crystal clear that what Derek Chauvin did is ultimately what killed him, what caused him to die, as you had pointed out, 2 cents. It's, it may not be 100% clear there, but as Night Shift points out, it definitely didn't help. See, and you're absolutely right to point out Derek Chauvin's prior history of violent actions as a police officer. I agree with you. I'm glad he's going away. Now, as far as the actual charges are concerned, well, that's a matter of legalese, and more to the point, even if one were to make the argument that what happened there didn't necessarily mesh up with, say, murder 2. With the parameters for that, that's fine. Okay, I could see that argument, but negligent manslaughter at best, at the very least, would be very, very reasonable. And frankly, just like you said, Night Shift, I'm glad the guy's going away.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to answer Purple Pill Philosophy. No, I'm not talking about I wasn't saying it was the first recorded case of police brutality. I'm just saying it was Derek Chauvin's first recorded case. It was basically he had committed really nasty acts of violence in his past, but this was the first time it was, that he was ever recorded as a police officer doing that. I'm not saying it's the first time ever. Of course not. I'm just saying it was the first time for Derek Chauvin.
Yes, I know. I think Derek Chauvin, pulling official records, he had at least 19 complaints filed against him for using excessive force.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not like Chauvin was just the model cop. And basically what makes analyzing this incident and so difficult is there are so many different issues all converging on this particular case. And I think even thinking to myself what I wanted to go over in this stream, it's hard to keep my thoughts together because it's crossing so many different, the area, morality, law, protection, security, law enforcement, issues of race. These are all things that became involved whether they should have or not. So to kind of help guide the discussion here, I want to first talk about the moral issues of what happened, Then we'll talk about the specific legal issues. Then we'll discuss the issue of race, and with it, we'll talk about the follow-on shooting of Ma'Khia Bryant and how that became part of this discussion, and then close off again just kind of our individual thoughts. So first, I just want to talk about the moral issues. Putting aside for a second what the law currently is. Let's, from a libertarian standpoint, morally, what exactly happened. George Floyd went to a convenience store and purchased a pack of cigarettes using a counterfeit bill. I'd like to point out the U.S. government counterfeits bills all the time. It's called the Federal Reserve. It's called the endless printing of money. And the only difference between the bill that George Floyd provided and the bill that is printed by the Federal Reserve is the fact that the government has declared that one is valuable and the other is not. They're both pieces of paper with ink on them. So I'd say, morally speaking, George Floyd did nothing wrong, at least in attempting to purchase cigarettes using a piece of paper with ink on it. Now, you could say that the convenience store was not willing to accept, did not want George Floyd's piece of paper. They wanted a government-issued piece of paper, and for that reason, he committed theft when stealing a pack of cigarettes. Okay, granted. If the store was unwilling to accept what George Floyd was offering and he falsely represented what he was offering, then yes, you could argue George Floyd committed theft. In which case, you would only be justified in compelling him to either give the cigarettes back or pay the amount of money for those cigarettes. You certainly would not be justified in assaulting him or having him killed. On the other hand, if in the process of trying to get that back, he had, trying to get their money back or get the cigarettes back, George Floyd had violently attacked them, you would be justified in defending yourself. But that does not seem to be what happened in this case. Now, the Minneapolis police had him arrested. Allegedly, he resisted arrest, although it's unclear what, the term resist arrest can mean a lot of things. It can mean pulled a gun and tried to shoot the police officers. It could mean tried to get away or didn't fully cooperate into getting in the back of the police car. It seems to me that even if it was the case that George Floyd committed theft and could therefore be compelled to repay the convenience store for a pack of cigarettes, what Derek Chauvin did was absolutely not justified. I would have to say I believe that keeping the knee on the back of his neck like that very clearly was excessive force in that case, and therefore he does deserve to be held accountable for that. Now, that being said, does it necessarily mean that he committed murder? I would say that is less clear. Well, it's certainly excessive force. Putting the knee on the back of someone's neck like that does not typically result in a person dying, and you couldn't necessarily know all the additional health problems. I would say if it contributed to his death, then you definitely have the case for manslaughter. But murder, again, that is not it's not as clean cut of a case for murder. Excuse me while I take a sip of coffee here. Night Shift, you have something to add?
Well, no. I just was taking my mic off mute, but no, keep going, really.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I think from a moral standpoint, and now from a moral standpoint, again, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out the fact that public law enforcement as an institution is inherently immoral because it involves the initiation of force against peaceful people. The basic syllogism is this: most legislation is unjust. All cops enforce all legislation. Therefore, all cops enforce unjust legislation. Therefore, law enforcement is unjust. Am I saying that all cops are bad people? No. I do believe that many people become cops because they genuinely want to protect they've been brainwashed like everyone else into believing that the government is a benevolent entity. They want to protect people who are in danger and protect their communities, and they believe that the best way they can do that is to become police officers. But when you analyze it, especially when you consider cases like Warren versus D.C. and the most recent Parkland shooting, the government has been very clear about this. Law enforcement does not exist to protect the public, and they have no legal obligation to do so. They exist to protect the interests of the government. Now, as it happens, sometimes your interests and the government's interests happen to align, and the police therefore do protect people in some circumstances. But when push comes to shove, if you are in danger and the police fail to protect you, you do not have any grievance against them because they do not exist to protect you. They will clean up after the fact. They will decide what laws were broken and lead to the enforcement of those laws, but they do not exist. It's ironic. Most police cars there are a lot of police cars that have the words "to protect and serve" written on them, and what's missing is the government, because they certainly don't exist to protect the public. If and when they do protect the public, it's merely a fact that your interests and the interests of the government happen to align in that circumstance. But as we've seen over and over again, like I said, Warren versus D.C., the Parkland shooting, and plenty of other cases, if the government's interests trump your interests as an individual, the police will always side with the government, even if it means you are harmed in the process. And certainly police officers, I'd say for every innocent person a police officer saves, they will spend much more time in their career initiating force against people committing victimless crimes, be that smoking marijuana, jaywalking, driving 5 miles over the speed limit, or anything else.
Exactly.
Yep.
Actually, I referenced Warren versus DC in my piece for InvictusMedia.tk. I don't know if you guys have seen it or not. It's titled "The Gun Manifesto," but yeah. Warren versus DC kind of clearly explains, the police aren't actually under any legal obligation to protect or serve you, the individual, like at all.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And ultimately, what I would say is there's good news on the horizon about this whole thing, because as I even covered in a video that I made a few months back, people are starting to wake up to the fact that the police do not serve them, that they do serve the government, as of the Washington, D.C. riots. But I mean, as we all know, it was instigated by a bunch of Trump supporters, a bunch of right wingers who thought that the cops were going to back them up. But when they actually started going after, when they started going after the Congress, and when they started rioting, the police were not on their side. The police were literally pointing out that they did not work for the people. They did not work for the people's interests. They protected the government, and the police fully did that. And the police turned on them. And there is good news on the horizon. It's that Americans are starting to wake up to this. Hopefully, in the next few years, we will see a vast majority of Americans wake up to the fact that the police are not on their side, and hopefully we will see the tides turn on a lot of these issues, and we will see the police maybe even have, maybe even their time will have come to an end, and we can actually have mass private security for individuals.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now before we get into the legal issues, however, there is the issue of whether or not Chauvin was given justice. Now, I think we've established pretty clearly whether or not, as it turns out, Chauvin's actions actually caused Floyd to die. Chauvin acted inappropriately. He used far more excessive force than was justified in that circumstance, and thus deserves to be held accountable. However, I would still hold that even if what Chauvin did was wrong, it is not justice unless he is held to the same standard that everyone else is. That is, he is entitled to a fair trial in front of an impartial jury in which only the facts of the case are used to decide whether or not he's guilty. Unfortunately, it cannot be said that that was the case in this circumstance. I mean, we're dealing with a jury who was told in no uncertain terms that if they did not find him guilty, they would be hunted down and killed, and their entire community would be burned to the ground. Now, if you find yourself accused of something, do you want to be tried by such a jury? I would say no. And for that reason, even if I believe Chauvin is guilty, even if I believe you can demonstrate Chauvin is guilty, he does not deserve to be tried by such a jury, and that's exactly what happened in this case. And as some commentators have pointed out, it very well, I mean, it's unclear whether or not this is going to happen, but it could be the case that that when Chauvin's attorneys appeal the verdict, and they will, they have, I believe, and it's brought before a higher court. A judge very well could rule that Chauvin is entitled to a mistrial and having this whole thing thrown out, because the jury was not sequestered as they should have been. They were allowed to, even though they were instructed not to watch the news and such by the judge. I mean, does anyone really believe they weren't aware that Maxine Waters had told a sitting member of Congress had told the people of Minneapolis that if he's not convicted, burn the city to the ground, kill cops everywhere, destroy homes and businesses?
Yeah,
you think they weren't aware of the fact that their local paper published enough information about each of them that finding out who they were would have been a simple matter, and that they likely would have been hunted down and killed by Black Lives Matter activists? Do you think they were not aware that several of the people who testified on behalf of Chauvin later had found severed pig heads on their doorsteps with blood splattered all over their property? Absolutely not. It's clear the jurors knew it is impossible that the jurors were unaware of this. So it is entirely possible, for example, that there was dissension in the jury. There could have been jurors who believed, rightly or wrongly, that the prosecution had not proved beyond all reasonable doubt that Chauvin was guilty, but they nonetheless voted that he was, because, holy crap, I could be killed and my community could be destroyed if I don't find him guilty. So I'd have to say I think it is perhaps a more relevant issue, despite the fact that what Chauvin did was wrong. I think it sets an even worse precedent that it can be seen as justice that juries can and should convict people under duress. In other words, I mean, imagine, obviously my impression and yours both as well is that Chauvin was guilty. But imagine had this been, a case. Think back to the Kavanaugh Christine Blasey Ford controversy. I'd say Christine Blasey Ford accused Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh of having assaulted her when they were teenagers, and the case she brought was absolute crap. She could not prove, even satisfy preponderance of the evidence standard that had likely occurred. However, there was great public pressure, and indeed many people who believed Kavanaugh was guilty and were willing to make violent threats to that effect. Would it be a good precedent to set if he had actually been in a criminal court and had been convicted solely because there were hundreds of angry people outside the courthouse ready to burn the city down? Of course not. That would be completely unjust. And for that reason, although I do believe Chauvin was guilty, I believe this was not a just trial, in that there existed this pressure on the jury to convict. And I think perhaps what illustrates this more than anything else is, it seems to me Chauvin was either guilty of murder or of manslaughter. Now, which one it is, I don't presume to pronounce, but it seems that if you are guilty of murder, then it's not manslaughter. If you're guilty of manslaughter, it's not murder. Yet they found him guilty of all three charges, which tells me the jury wasn't really concerned about the facts in this case. They simply knew we better find him guilty on everything, or else the city is going to get burned down. And that, even if what Chauvin did was wrong, that's not justice.
I agree. I'll say again, I'm not sad that he ultimately is going away. But yes, this sets a very dangerous precedent, because as has been said many times, a person who is accused of a crime has the right to a fair and impartial trial by jury. And this clearly was not that. And as you pointed out, 2 Cents, yeah, there's no way in hell that those jurors didn't know what was being said. They didn't know. There's no way. Yeah, they knew what the score was. They knew there was a violent, angry mob just waiting outside that courthouse. They knew. So my guess is that, this is just my interpretation of this. Maybe they just went ahead and went along with it and found him guilty on everything. If nothing else, for, basic self-preservation, reasons. Maybe you could even call that a dash of pragmatism, I guess. But yeah, the trial as it was conducted itself, given all of this, yeah, that's not justice. As much as I do like seeing the guy go away for what he did, the bare fact is that's not justice. Anyway, Night Shift, what do you got?
No, it wasn't justice. At least, I mean, even if the verdict was justified, no, it was not justice. It was a judgment under duress, and don't get me wrong. Again, it wasn't justified. It was a justified verdict. what Derek Chauvin got, but no, based on what it was built upon, it was not actual justice. However,
Perhaps the best way to put it is it could be the case that the verdict was just, but it was nonetheless an unjust trial.
exactly. However, no, honestly, I don't. Here's the thing: I don't know if it will get judged as a mistrial by a higher court because, I mean, again, the pressure is kind of still there, and ultimately, that higher court might also be kind of under the pressure of, well, if we do appeal this, then all hell is going to break loose there. So, I mean, really, do we want to do that? So, they even if it was judged a mistrial, I highly doubt it's going to go on any further than that, mainly because of the duress that's ultimately there, and even a higher court's got to be able to see that. No, if they do it, yeah, it will be, overturning it will, be justice in a sense, but it is going to cause a shit ton of trouble if they do it. So I'm not sure that it's going to go any further than this. I could be wrong though.
Okay.
Hey, we got Pipsqueak.
Indeed, and I want to address his comment here because this is an excellent transition. So that's the moral issues of the case in question. I do, however, want to discuss the legal issues as they were written, because I think another important thing to talk about here is whether or not the state itself is being consistent. Now, we can argue that most of the state's legislation is unjust, but then the question becomes, does the state, if even setting aside the question of whether or not legislation is just, is the state even consistent with its own legislation? You could say that the state is unjust but consistent. However, it would be even worse if the state passes unjust legislation and then enforces it inconsistently. And that's, I think, what Pipsqueak is talking about here. All the evidence I've seen, Pipsqueak says, points that Chauvin was doing exactly what he was trained to do. Is anyone advocating that the people who conducted and approved that training be charged with anything? And excellent question. So let's now, setting aside the moral issue for a second, as the laws are written, was Chauvin acting in accordance with the law? It seems to me the defense did actually make a pretty good case that Chauvin, it could not be proved beyond all reasonable doubt that Chauvin was acting against the training he had received and against the use of force policies that the Minneapolis Police Department had written at that time. Also, the legal definitions of second-degree, third-degree murder, and manslaughter, it's difficult those charges themselves conflict with one another, and therefore, as the laws were written, it seems that from a strictly legal standpoint, it could not be the case that he was guilty of all three. He would have had to be guilty of one and not the others, and vice versa. But we see that, and at least setting aside the question of whether or not law enforcement is moral, it seems that from a purely legal standpoint, they are authorized to use force if they deem it necessary. There was nothing explicitly in the Minneapolis Police Department procedures that show that Chauvin was doing was acting explicitly against those use of force policies. So from a strictly legal standpoint, it would seem that the fact that Chauvin is being convicted is an inconsistency in the state itself. Had Chauvin not been convicted, I would have said it was an injustice because what he did was wrong, but it may have been the case that what he did was legal. In this case, it seems the state is turning on its own principles, even though, well unjust, the state is being inconsistent with its own legislation, and therefore more or less throwing Chauvin under the bus, not because they believe he did anything wrong, but because of the public pressure to do so to fit a certain narrative.
Yeah, I kind of agree with this, and like I said before, this sets kind of a dangerous precedent for cases going forward. Now, don't get me wrong. Like I said, I am not sorry that he's going away, at least for the time being. We'll see what happens with a higher court, but at the same time, basically what this seems to say to me, in a way, is that if there is enough public outcry, if there's enough public pressure, well, then the right to an impartial jury trial is meaningless. And, yeah, what does that say about justice? Not to mention the simple fact that, yeah, if the state is now effectively flip-flopping on its own legislation, well, then that really is a tacit admission on their part that the said legislation was meaningless to begin with.
And as Pipsqueak pointed out, if it was the case that Chauvin was doing exactly what he was trained to do by legal government authorities, and we've now decided that what they were trained to do was wrong, why are they not being brought to trial?
Exactly.
Yeah, there's a good question.
Okay. Now, so before we run too far, because, I mean, certainly we could talk about this for hours and hours, but we should get to probably what I think is the most egregious point in this entire discussion. We can talk about the morality of law enforcement, and I think as we demonstrated earlier on, law enforcement is itself an unjust institution because it necessarily involves the initiation of force against peaceful people. Legally, we've now demonstrated the state can't even be consistent with its own legislation because even though what Chauvin did was immoral, it doesn't seem they really proved that he was acting against the state's own legislation. But finally, what's been underlying all this, and really what was brought to light by the Ma'Khia Bryant shooting that happened immediately thereafter, is that the narrative that those on the political left have been trying to use the George Floyd situation to further is not really that law enforcement is inherently unjust. It's not really that police brutality is a problem. What they've been trying to use it to prove is that there is a racism epidemic in America, and this was clear and convincing evidence that Derek Chauvin, a white police officer, shot George Floyd, a black man, because, or no, not shot, but killed George Floyd, a black man, because he was black. Now, again, I think what Chauvin clearly did was excessive force. It was not justified, even assuming, as it turns out, that Floyd was guilty of the crime of stealing a pack of cigarettes. It is not just to use excessive force against him and have him forcibly arrested for that reason. But there is no indication, at least that I've seen, that Chauvin did what he did because George Floyd was black. In fact, Chauvin had a history of complaints against him for police brutality, and I've not seen anyone present any evidence that he only acted this way because George Floyd was black.
Night Shift, what do you got?
No, that was pretty good. We should probably move on.
Okay. Now, just quickly, I'm gonna a couple statistics that everyone should be aware of, and if you'd like to, the citations for these are available on my video. What Black Lives Matter means to an old brainwashed 11-year-old kid. If you go to my2centsvideos.com, you can find the links for all these sources. But here are a couple things that are in fact true in America. 93% of black homicide victims are killed by other black civilians, not by police officers. Blacks do commit violent crimes 7 to 10 times at a 7 to 10 times higher rate than whites do. Black crime is even more prevalent in large cities, most of which are run by Democrats and those on the political left. And the percentage of blacks arrested for crimes is consistent with police reports. So basically, while there are certainly issues with police brutality, while there are certainly issues with law enforcement as an institution, the claim that law enforcement are disproportionately targeting black people because they are black is simply something for which there is no evidence. Which it's important to compare and contrast a case like George Floyd's with the case of Ma'Khia Bryant's, in that George Floyd, at most, the only thing he did wrong in this case was steal a pack of cigarettes. Is that wrong? Yes, but hardly worthy of the amount of force that was used against him in that case. On the other hand, Ma'Khia Bryant, a black teenager who appears, again, a trial has not been conducted, so I don't know what all the background facts are, but from the footage that has been released, Ma'Khia Bryant was actively trying to stab another black teenager to death, resulting in a police officer warning her and subsequently shooting her so as to save that other person's life. But of course, almost immediately, the media picked up the narrative that a white police officer had shot a black teenage girl, conveniently leaving out the fact that she had been trying to stab another person to death at the time. And of course, I'm sure you all are aware that famous race baiter LeBron James tweeted out a picture of the police officer saying "You're next" #accountability. And of course, they're trying to further the narrative. There is an epidemic of police brutality specifically against blacks. The Ma'Khia Bryant trial is nothing like George Floyd's, in that we'll see what the investigation bears out. But if it is indeed the case that she was actively trying to kill another person, then anyone, a police officer or otherwise, would have been justified in using deadly force to protect themselves and someone else.
Go ahead, Night Shift. What do you got?
Well, honestly, Um, I don't know if there's really much to say on the whole racism counter on this one. However, I do want to make the point that in the case where this girl had a knife and she was trying to stab someone to death, I do just want to make this argument, and it does kind of show how badly police officers are trained, or how much they're trained to kill, because in other countries, and I've seen evidence of this. There are police officers in other countries like Germany. In fact, one of the cases would actually be from Germany, where there was a German police officer. He did have his gun out, and he did fire. He did fire on the suspect, but the suspect had both a machete and a buck knife in both of his hands, and the officer was able to wound him, and both the suspect and the officer actually survived the encounter. The thing about it is that in other countries like Germany and whatnot, there seems to be more. They seem to be doing better than us when it comes to police officers and suspect survivability in those situations. Whereas in the United States, even if it's a freaking screwdriver, police officers will more than likely kill the suspect without even batting an eye. It does seem like in this country there is kind of a problem on that end, whereas police officers are trained more to kill the suspect under any circumstances, whereas in other countries they are trained how to actually wound the suspect and make it out of the encounter alive, and make it so that the suspect can get out of the encounter alive. So I would say that our country does have kind of a problem on that front. But I don't know. Could he have shot her, wounding her, and could she have made it out alive? I don't know. But it just seems,
Well,
it
okay.
seems kind of suspect to me.
Well, if I can chime in just for a second here, and this is coming from, years of experience with marksmanship, my time in the military, you go down the list. Okay, now what you're describing, Night Shift, and I agree with you. It doesn't matter if it's a screwdriver. It seems that the police are all too eager to just reach for a firearm and just open fire. That sounds like more of a problem with understanding escalation of force. A screwdriver versus a 9mm or a 45 caliber pistol. Who's going to win that fight? Let's get real here.
Exactly.
And that is definitely a problem with our police force here in America. I absolutely agree with you. Now, if anyone were to try to argue that, and believe it or not, a buddy of mine from the Free Thinkers group that I'm a member of, Theron, had brought this to my attention the other day. Someone actually said, blah, 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 wah, wah, wah. Why didn't you try to shoot her in the leg? And the first thought that went through my head was, oh my God, you don't know anything about guns, marksmanship, or anatomy. I could not help but think to myself, this person doesn't have any clue how many major blood vessels there are in the leg, nor do they have any clue how hard it is to hit someone in the leg. You hit a moving target in the leg and not miss.
And if I can chime in here quickly, I think
go ahead.
I agree with you, Mikhail, in that I think the discussion of escalation of force is important. However, I think when it comes to shooting to kill versus shooting to wound, the difficulty is a firearm is a lethal weapon. It is extremely difficult. Anyone who's trained with a firearm, as Mikhail says he has, would know that it is extremely difficult to shoot someone with the intention of only wounding them. Whenever you shoot someone, there is inherently a lethal threat. Now, is it possible that a person could be shot and not die? Of course it's possible. But especially a moving target, and given the kind of damage a firearm is capable of doing, like a taser, for example, is a non-lethal weapon. A firearm is a lethal weapon, and while a discharging a firearm doesn't necessarily mean the person will die. I think it is extremely difficult as a matter of policy to teach officers to employ firearms with the purpose of only wounding and not killing.
Oh, I absolutely agree. Just to quickly touch on that real fast, believe it or not, that's actually why, you know, any marksmanship course that you're likely ever going to take, if you haven't already, I imagine you probably have, they will tell you straight to your face, you aim center of mass. And the reason for that is twofold. One, the center of the torso, believe it or not, is not where the heart is. And the heart is obviously the most immediately lethal organ, so to speak. If you hit someone in, center of mass, or if you're off by just a little bit, let's say you hit them in the lung, needle chest compression, decompression, excuse me, it is a thing. And yeah, they can survive that. There are plenty of areas, that a person could be shot in as it relates to their torso, or perhaps, coming from the back, same thing, basically, that they can survive from, which is another reason why you shoot center of mass. One, it is a larger target area, so there's a good chance you're going to hit your intended target, as opposed to, in this case, the other girl was literally, not even 2 feet from her, like right behind where the cop shot. So,
Yes.
So, what if he had missed? What if he had aimed for her leg and had missed? Well, we got a problem here real fast. And the other reason is that, believe it or not, being hit in the torso, there's actually a fairly good chance that the victim, so to speak, the person who was shot, there's a good chance they actually will survive. Now, is it a guarantee? No, you're absolutely right. A firearm is a lethal weapon. It is lethal force. However, given the situation, from what I've seen, what I've read, I'm not sure that particular officer could have done anything differently. I really don't know. I mean, you tell me.
Okay, I just want to quick thank Dragon Lady for the $20 super chat. Funny how the Ma'Khia Bryant case is plastered all over international news, but the case of a 16-year-old white kid with an airport gun killed by Maryland police a couple weeks ago barely makes a ripple in the media. Absolutely, and that's going to be the closing point, one of the closing points, so we will get to that. Thank you very much for the super chat. But yes, I would say to that point, Mikhail, in principle, the Ma'Khia Bryant posed a lethal threat to another person. Now, what were the specific circumstances leading up to that? I don't know. I'm sure an investigation is going to bear that out. But I think in principle, if someone is threatening you with deadly force, and a knife is indeed deadly force, you would be justified in using deadly force either to protect yourself or protect someone else. Now, here's, I think, where the fact that it was a police officer complicates the issue. Again, law enforcement, by their very necessity, initiate force. And because one of the biggest factors in determining whether or not lethal force was justified is who was the aggressor in this case. Now, suppose because if a private citizen, suppose I'm in my house, someone breaks into my house with a knife and I use a firearm to kill them. And then suppose the person's family tries to sue and claim that I used excessive force. I could have stopped the person without using a firearm. Now, maybe that's true, but in that case, that person was trespassing on my property. They broke the lock to get in my house and threatened me with deadly force. It's going to be very difficult in that case to argue that I was unjustified in using deadly force to defend myself, considering that they were the aggressor in every sense. It was my property. They were trespassing on my property. They, in fact, broke a lock to get into my house and then assaulted me. I mean, just the odds that you're going to prove that it was excessive force to use a firearm to defend myself are very, very low. It's going to be only extreme circumstance to show that. On the other hand, when you're a police officer who routinely uses force in unjust matters, who was the question? Who was the aggressor in this case? Was it the Ma'Khia Bryant? Was it the other person? I think the fact that police routinely do use force for unjust purposes kind of obscures the who was the aggressor question. Now, in this case, do I think solely based on the facts that have been reported, this was a justified shooting? Yes, I think that police, it appears, and who knows what the investigation will bear out, but it appears that that police officer saved the other person from being killed. But since police routinely do use force for unjustified reasons, oftentimes in these cases it obscures, it's more difficult to determine who exactly is the aggressor given that fact.
Oh yes, absolutely. I do not disagree with you there at all. I simply wanted to point out, as far as the lethal force itself is concerned. Well, she was literally trying to gut another human being who was like 2 or 3 feet from her. So there's that. But yes, you're absolutely right. It does. The fact that the police routinely use force, even lethal force, for utterly unnecessary and unjust reasons, in my opinion. Yeah, it does definitely make this more nuanced. So I look forward to finding out more about this case personally. What do you got, Night Shift?
No, I actually am looking forward to finding out things about this case too, and yeah, just figuring things out, solving mysteries on that front. And yeah, I mean, who truly was the aggressor in this case? It's a good question.
And that really is kind of, I wanted to close on this point. I think the relevant, none of these cases are ever black and white. They always need to be evaluated based on the specific facts in that case, which is why it's so important that every defendant be entitled to a fair trial against an impartial jury where only the facts of the specific case are determined. But I think here is getting into the case, the final point I want to close on, why privatized police could resolve a lot of these issues. Because of the fact that since law enforcement is an inherently unjust institution, they routinely use force against people who have committed peaceful crimes. For which there is no victim. It's only a crime in virtue of the state saying it's a crime. What would the difference be if you've got private police? Well, privatized police, in which people are directly paying a protection service to protect their business, they now carry with them an obligation to protect the people who are paying them and serve their interests. Cases in that circumstance, cases are going to be resolved in pretty matter-of-factly and for establishing who was the aggressor, whose property did the crime occur on, who was the victim of the crime, and what were the circumstances leading up to the situation. So earlier on, one of the commenters, I've forgotten who it was now, asked, how would the George Floyd situation have been handled in Ancapistan? Well, I would say in a libertarian society where you're dealing with privatized protection forces, how would it have been dealt with? Well, you've got a person who came into a convenience store to purchase a pack of cigarettes. It is up to that convenience store to decide what they are going to accept as payment for said cigarettes. And I think you're more than likely going to be using either gold and silver or a form of cryptocurrency or something that is other than government-issued fiat currency, which will render the recognizing counterfeits a lot. It's going to be a lot easier for the convenience store involved. So it may be the case that George Floyd would try to pay with something they weren't willing to accept. They'd say, we're not willing to accept this, and he'd walk out without his cigarettes. On the other hand, suppose he forcibly steals the cigarettes. In that case, your private protective services would attempt to would use the minimal amount of force necessary to get him to either return the cigarettes or pay an equivalent amount of money based on what the store was selling the cigarettes for. If George Floyd then attempted to use force against the private police forces, they would be justified in escalating in order to protect themselves. But as McHale pointed out, you've got an escalation of force. If someone tried to argue that they were escalating, they used excessive force, then they could be brought before a private court to be tried by that crime. However, in that case, again, you would have private protection services on private property who were attempting to use the minimal amount of force necessary to correct the violation. And if George Floyd or whoever it was had escalated and used violence against them, then, like the case I presented where someone is on trespassing on your property, breaks into your house, and attacks you, it's going to be much more difficult to prove that excessive force was used, considering you've got a very clearly defined case where it's private property who was the aggressor, and in that case, the person who stole is very clearly is aggressor. All these complicating factors that existed in the George Floyd case are only there given the government itself.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
Quickly, Jonathan O., thank you very much for the $5 super chat. How do you think we should solve police brutality ASAP? I'm going to say the answer is privatize police. Now, and here is perhaps the last. That's how I think the situation would be solved. But let's suppose in Ancapistan, the case goes to trial and you are not satisfied with how it is resolved. One way or another, the private protection, you believe the private protection services officers used unjust force, but they were not held accountable. What can you do that you can't do with public law enforcement? You can say, I think this public protection service is brutal. I don't want to use them anymore. I'm going to withdraw my funding for this private protective service and go with another private protective service that I think can do a better job.
There you go.
And when you've
said.
And when you've got competing protection services that are therefore accountable to their customers because their customers can withdraw payment, you're going to have a much better operating police force. And I think for those that know a thing or two about private security, there are a lot of different private security firms that exist in any given area, and businesses and people who need private security can consider questions like who's offering the cheapest service compared to who's providing better services, who's got a better reputation. You know, what are the qualifications of the officers involved? These are all decisions you can make and choose to pay or not pay. The problem with law enforcement that makes them so unaccountable is the fact that they are paid through coercive taxation, and regardless of how poorly you think law enforcement is doing its job, you cannot defund them because the state will forcibly take your money through taxation, and they will continue to exist. And no one else is allowed to compete with them because the state has declared a monopoly on the arbitration of force.
Mm-hmm. And hold on, just let me finish with this. Another beautiful thing about private police and private security is the only real offenses or crimes they can go up against are violent crimes or crimes where an actual violent act has been done against another person. They can't enforce against prohibitionary measures. They can't enforce against nuisance measures. It's only real crimes that they can go up against, and they're completely defensive. However, had this happened in Ancapistan, in all honesty, let's say that George Floyd had gone into that store. He had tried to steal a pack of cigarettes. The cashier had seen them. I honestly don't think it would have even come to the cashier hiring private security. I'm pretty sure the cashier would have just pointed a gun at him and said, return the cigarettes or I'm going to blow your damn head off. And the store owner would have been justified in defending himself and his property in that way of, basically doing that because George Floyd is committing a violent crime in that sense that he is trying to steal. And so the store owner would be justified in defending himself and his property in that way. And so more than likely it would have come to, the store owner would have just basically pointed a gun at him, told him put the pack of cigarettes back. And more than likely, if George Floyd wasn't a complete moron about it, he more than likely would have just done so and left. So it probably wouldn't have even come to the cashier calling for private security. It probably just would have come to him, basically pulling a gun out and saying, return my stolen merchandise and get the hell out of my store. So, that's just my own scenario on it.
Mm-hmm. And another thing to consider, when it comes to cases of theft, oftentimes the business owner has to decide whether or not going after it is even worth it. If you're going to spend more on legal fees getting your stolen merchandise back, you may decide it's not worth it. It's entirely possible, and as happens quite a lot. Suppose a kid comes into a store and steals a candy bar and runs away. Hey, and the clerk is shouting "stop" as the kid runs out. you might call the police, but in all honesty, there are a lot of convenience store owners that would probably just say it's a candy bar. Do I really want to waste the time and resources it takes to go after a kid who stole a candy bar?
Right.
I think a lot of store owners would just
Yeah.
say, you know what was it morally wrong? Yes, but is it worth it for me to waste the time and resources it would take to hold that person accountable? Probably not. Just like if somebody cuts across your front lawn, you might yell, "Hey, get off my property," but are you going to call the police?
No.
Probably not, especially if the
No.
person goes running. I mean, it's whether or not it can be the case that things are morally wrong, but it's simply not worth expending the resources holding them accountable, and that's something every private individual has to decide.
Yeah,
Mikhail,
exactly.
did you want to add anything?
No, actually, you said it pretty well, Night Shift.
Okay, cool.
Now, Lights473 asks an interesting question here. Is there a difference between private police and private security? My answer is under a status system, yes. Under a libertarian society, Ancapistan, no, there wouldn't be. In our current legal system, private police are essentially private security officers who are granted the authority to arrest and enforce the laws of the state, but they are paid privately by an institution. For example, to give a common example, a lot of hospitals employ private police officers in that they are employed by the hospital is their employer. The hospital pays them money to protect the hospital, but they also have worked out a contractual agreement with the state that allows those officers to enforce violations of the law in a way that other private security officers are not allowed to do so. However, in an Ancapistan libertarian society, there would practically be no difference since there would be no state. A private security officer and a private police officer would be essentially the same. They would be justified. The factor that determined whether or not they could arrest, whether or not they could use force, would again be who is the aggressor and is the amount of force proportionate to the violation.
Yeah.
Well put.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And again, I think it's worth pointing out, no libertarian is claiming that in a anarcho-capitalist society would be completely just. Of course, there would be people committing crimes. People would sometimes get away with crimes. Would private police officers, private security officers in such a society use brutality? Yes, those kinds of things would occur. The difference is, at least you've got a fair shot of being able to hold them accountable. Would they always be held accountable? No, but you got a much better chance of holding them accountable. I forget, off the top of my head, I forget who made this quote, but it was, anarchy is no guarantee that people will not steal and hurt others. Statism is a guarantee that at least some will.
Yes.
Mhm.
I don't know who said that, but yes, very well put.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I actually used that quote in one of my videos too on this. And yeah, I mean, the other thing about it is that in an ANCAP society, libertarian society, those things would still happen. Of course, no ANCAP worth their salt is going to say that Ancapistan or an ANCAP society would be a utopian society. Of course, that is not true, but it would happen a lot less. I mean, the point that we're making is that with anarcho-capitalism, with the libertarianism, it would happen a hell of a lot less than it does now. And there's far more chance, like what my 2 cents said, there's far more chances of people actually being able to acquire some real justice when it does happen. So,
yeah, and if push comes to shove, in such a society, if push comes to shove, let's suppose a private security officer commits a brutal action, they are not held accountable. You, the consumer, can say to that private protection services, I am no longer paying you for your services, I'm going to go with a competitor. At least you have that right.
And J.C. Armitage, yes, Gustav de Molinari, one of my personal heroes of the philosophy of anarcho-capitalism and libertarian, he was the one who said that.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Nice.
All right, so some closing points. One, I think that what Derek Chauvin did was unjust and he should have been held accountable. Two, it is nonetheless the case that I unfortunately don't think we can call his conviction justice, given the nature of how the jury was coerced into giving the guilty plea. Three, there is absolutely no basis for the claim that this had anything to do with race or racism. The problem is the inherent structure of public law enforcement and police brutality, not law enforcement. And I can only hope that maybe more people will be encouraged to look at the benefits of privatizing police as opposed to either continued support of law enforcement in its current form or claiming defund, this whole defund the police movement. Well, I would agree. I think we should privatize police. The whole defund the police movement is really a sham because all they advocate is getting rid of police in their current form and replacing them with a different organization of a different name that essentially does the same thing: compulsory funded armed enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Oh, and Jonathan O, thank you for the $5 super chat. Make a video about the banana republics. Okay. If you'd like to.
Okay, maybe.
If you'd like to send me a more detailed either email on Twitter or whoever you wish to contact me, explain a little more detail what you're looking for, and I certainly will be willing to consider it. Thank you for the super chat. All right, thanks everyone for checking out this stream. If you disagree, agree, have any other thoughts, by all means, put them in the comments below. Perhaps we'll discuss those things on a follow-on stream, because I did think this was a productive discussion. And as always, Night Shift, Mikhail, thanks for being here. Thank you for your continued support of my channel. And as always, that is my 2 cents. Take it for what it's worth.